Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. So today's story is very similar in some aspects to the story of Leslie Bull Allen, which I covered last episode. More people are aware of the photo of John Barney Hines than the man in it. In fact, he was brought to my attention following a TikTok video I did on the capture of Mephisto, which will be the feature of an upcoming episode, and his story fascinated me after seeing the photo myself. John Hines, born Johannes Hayem, was born in Liverpool, England on the 11th of October 1873 to German-Irish immigrants. However, very little is known of his early life, save from the age of 14, he saw Queen Victoria on her Golden Jubilee tour, and after seeing all the pomp and ceremony, left home to enlist in the British Army, only to have his mother protest for his return. In 1895, at the age of 22, Hines accepted the Queen's shilling and joined the King's Liverpool Regiment, only to be deemed non-effective. The following year he joined the Royal Navy, serving as a stoker on the shore installation HMS Victory II. He would go on to serve in the Boxer Rebellion, and following a bout of malaria, quote, he would be discharged as objectionable, unquote. Now, there is some inconsistency and discrepancies in his military service, with some accounts, including interviews with Hines himself on how long he was in both the Army and Navy, listing dates that don't actually line up and considerable overlap, but then there's also issues when he actually changed his name. What is known is that he married Hannah Mayer in 1899, and they would go on to have 2 children together. The same year he was married, Hines would be working as a merchant mariner and travelled to Cape Town to participate in the Second Anglo-Boer War to join Driscoll's Scouts, a reconnaissance unit, before transferring to Kitchener's Scouts, Kitchener's Horse, Brabant Scouts, Remington Scouts, and then finally to the 1st Imperial Bushmen, an Australian mounted unit which comprised of soldiers from the newly federated 6 colonies of Australia. He must have had an affinity with these Australians, as when the Imperial Bushmen returned to Australia in 1902, Hines followed them, and he promptly abandoned his family in the process. What happened between 1902 and the outbreak of the First World War, however, is a matter of conjecture, with his own accounts and official records placing him in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and, quote, every state of the United States of America, unquote, working various jobs and having several run-ins with the authorities. In July 1915, Hines was back in Australia and attempted to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force, but was rejected on medical grounds on account of having hemorrhoids. Though there is also no account that he was over the maximum allowed age to enlist at the time, he did lie about his age, and interestingly, he listed a sister as his next of kin, not his estranged wife, though sadly not much is known about her fate, and no divorce papers have ever surfaced. Not to be dissuaded, he would finally be accepted on the 8th of May 1916 and sent as reinforcements to the 45th Battalion and sent to France. He departed Sydney aboard the troop ship HMAT Wiltshire on the 22nd of August 1916 and arrived in Plymouth, England in October that year before officially joining the 45th Battalion. As a soldier, Hines, according to his commanders while he was on the front line, was, quote, a tower of strength to the 45th, unquote. However, out of it, he caused a number of grey hairs for his superiors. For the men of the 45th, he was a well-regarded soldier, even if they found this towering, heavily tattooed 40-year-old man and some of his actions particularly erratic and off-putting, going so far to give him the nickname Wild Eyes due to a very off-putting stare. But as he was an effective soldier in the trenches, he was given a lot of liberties, preparing to go, quote, over the top with sandbags filled with Mills bombs, a kind of early hand grenade instead of his rifle and bayonet. This weapon he would use with great efficiency. Considering how he was roughly the same height as Bull Allen, the thought of having a 5'10" man charging at you throwing hand grenades at whim is simply terrifying. The other weapon he showed proficiency in was the Lewis gun, which he used with great effect. This efficiency would lend itself to the kind of warfare experienced by the Australians on the Western Front, with the German forces regularly employing concrete pillboxes and bunkers to reinforce their positions. During the Battle of Messines, for example, Hines came across a German pillbox, and while taunting the Germans failed to bring them out, it is then alleged that he climbed onto its roof and used those Mills bombs to block up the entrances before throwing a number inside. This killing a number of Germans and reportedly capturing another 63, including a general. This kind of ferocity led many experts to believe that he killed more Germans than any other person in the AIF. During the course of this battle, Hines would also be wounded, and while he recovered, he allegedly stole a horse and traded it for whiskey. This was not uncommon behaviour for Hines, as the other thing that he was good at was looting, and it was something that he undertook at every opportunity. But it wasn't solely German equipment he would take. He would avail himself of wallets, rings, medals, pistols, watches, overcoats, off of any German he encountered, were either dead, wounded, or as a prisoner of war. Furniture, alcohol, and currency, or anything not bolted down, was also fair game for the Souvenir King. He would regularly come back to the Allied lines with the Hessian bags he used to carry Mills bombs, now full of captured loot. It is rumoured that he souvenired over £1 million worth of German equipment, and while the Australian War Records Section, the agency responsible for the collecting of relics and trophies for display in Australia after the war, would be established around the same time, there is zero record of Hines giving any of his trophies to the agency. He famously acquired a grandfather clock and left it in the trenches during one foray, which apparently drew the attention of the German forces and the ire of his local men as it chimed the hour and immediately drew an artillery barrage. Hines would be officially wounded twice, once at Messines and again at Villers-Bretonneux, both in 1917, though he would claim to be wounded 5 times. Following his foray in horse wrangling, he rejoined his unit in time for the Battle of Polygon Wood, and it was during this battle that Australian official war photographer Frank Hurley came across Hines sitting amongst his latest hoard of trophies and took arguably his most famous photo. It shows a weary-looking Hines in a German soldier's cap surrounded by artillery shells, links of machine gun ammunition, potato masher-style hand grenades, helmets, rifles, canteens, personal effects, and is counting a wad of captured francs and German marks. While Hines was well known as a trophy hunter, Hurley's predilection for fabricating photos for maximum impact has me wondering just how much of the loot around Hines was actually captured by him during this time. Regardless, this photograph would be widely circulated both in Australia and in Europe, and allegedly caused Kaiser Wilhelm to issue a bounty on Hines. There's no actual evidence this happened, but the propaganda value was well known. There also was plenty of myths about him, so it's entirely possible. The ferocity he exhibited on the battlefield was mirrored by what could only be called his appalling behaviour off it. He was court-martialed 9 times for drunkenness, impeding police investigations, forging 40 entries to his paybook, and being absent without leave. Hines also claims that he was caught robbing the strong room at Amiens, though there doesn't appear to be anything on his record about it. As a result of this, despite receiving a number of field promotions, he would be repeatedly demoted back to private and fined a total of 168 days pay and spent considerable time in detention. This need for cash has led some to believe that this is why he was so obsessively looting and selling those trophies to other soldiers, though it seemed the funds he would gain were usually spent buying alcohol. His service would finally come to an end in the middle of 1918 when he would be medically discharged due to hemorrhoid problems and the effects of constant gassing. He would return to Australia in October 1918, along with probably most of his trophies. Even though he was back in Australia, he was unexpectedly severely traumatised by his experiences. You could make the argument that his erratic behaviour away from the front line was an early indicator for post-traumatic stress disorder in a time when this wasn't properly understood. After the war, Hines lived in a humpy, a kind of temporary structure akin to a lean-to made of hessian sacks and saplings he built for himself on the outskirts of Sydney near Mount Druitt, and which he would adorn with his trophies, especially the wire fence which he would hang German helmets from that he had taken from the battlefield. He would go on to live as an unmarried loner, but he would become well known amongst the local populace and apparently terrified young children, though he accordingly was a gentle soul who offered help to anyone who needed it. Sadly, he was unable to find consistent work, and lived predominantly on his army pension and the occasional odd job he could get. He would also bolster his income by selling his souvenirs, and occasionally Frank Hurley's photograph of him would resurface in an article or exhibit, which returned him briefly to the public's attention. Despite living in near poverty, he would travel to the Concord Repatriation Hospital each week to donate a suitcase of vegetables that he had grown for the former soldiers recuperating there. Charles Bean, the First World War official historian and founder of what would become the Australian War Memorial, also considered Hines to be a celebrity and had him featured with 50 others in the Returned and Services League of Australia publication Reveille in the 20s and 30s. This attention would result in donations and increase to his pension, but little else. Hurley's photo would be eventually prominently displayed at the Australian War Memorial's permanent building in Australia's capital when it was opened. However, there is no knowledge to see whether or not Hines actually saw it. It should be noted that when war broke out, however, in 1939, the now 64-year-old Hines presented himself to Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park, Sydney to sign up. This was at the same time when many were debating whether or not he was still alive, despite his regular appearance at Anzac Day marches. While he was understandably rejected on grounds of his health and age, despite proving he could still march just as good as any of the young recruits. He was so determined to serve that he stowed away on a troop transport until he was discovered and hauled before the commanding officer of the unit, Major General Arthur Tubby Allen, who happened to be his old 45th Australian Infantry Battalion commanding officer. He was promptly informed that this was a young man's war and then shown the gangway. On the 29th of January 1958, at the age of 85, Private John Barney Hines died at the Concord Repatriation Hospital and was buried at Rookwood Cemetery in a pauper's grave. This laid unmarked until 1971, when the Mount Druitt sub-branch of the Return and Services League paid for a headstone. The Blacktown City Council would also rename the street he lived on in his honour, and in 2002 the Mount Druitt Council would commission a monument dedicated to him, and his photo would once again adorn the wall of the Australian War Memorial in 2013-2014 as its First World War gallery was undergoing redevelopment. It now sits on permanent display also within its galleries. Much like Bull Allen, historians have argued that John Hines was worthy of some form of decoration for gallantry and bravery, solely based on his battlefield exploits, and if you look at it in a vacuum, that's definitely the case. But it's also most likely that his behaviour off the battlefield made him ineligible. He could have had great honours, potentially even the Victoria Cross, and could have had similar fame to the photo Hurley took of him, which is sad because while he was just doing his job, his off-the-field antics simply cannot be ignored. And that, my friends, is the story of the life, service and legacy of the Souvenir King of the AIF, Private John Barney Hines. Catch you next time, friends. Bye. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gangdangara people whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. This episode was written, researched, produced, directed and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. If you do know someone whose story needs to be told, feel free to leave a comment on an episode or send us an email at iwasonlydoingmyjobpod@gmail.com. If you like what we do here and you want to support this podcast, the best thing you can do is share this with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as it really helps others find the show. And if you want to join in on the conversation, join us over on Discord, and if you want more content including show notes, photos, transcripts, and my various adventures finding memorials dotted around Australia, head over to our website at www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on all our social media pages at IWODMJ. Don't worry, there are links to everything in the show notes. Join me personally for more bite-sized history over on TikTok and pretty much everywhere else at Doc Winters. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or opinions of any entity, agency, or organization. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.